Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating. We're going to take a massive piece of modern pop culture, a literal classic breakup anthem, and treat it as a standalone, serious literary text. We're looking at the lyrics to Kanye West's Heartless, to decode its narrative arc, its intense use of hyperbole, and the deeply human emotional themes baked right into it. Whether you've memorized every single word or you barely know the chorus, when you strip away the production and just look strictly at the text, this incredibly vivid story emerges. It's a story all about grief, absolute alienation, and this really desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control after a totally catastrophic loss.
So let's jump right in. Look at how the narrator immediately frames the aftermath of this breakup. He doesn't just casually say, "Hey, we had a fight," or "things didn't work out." No, he calls it the coldest story ever told. Literally from the very first line, we are told this isn't just a sad event. It's this epic, almost mythic tragedy. And the fact that it's being talked about in the night instantly gives it the heavy weight of folklore or legend.
Which naturally brings us to the biggest question. What actually makes a breakup the coldest story ever told? Like, what elevates this specific fallout from a standard, everyday argument into something this profound? Throughout this explainer, we're going to use the text itself to dissect the anatomy of this heartbreak. We'll see exactly how the narrator constructs the narrative, how he paints his former partner, and ultimately how he scrambles to find an exit strategy.
Let's start with part 1, the coldest story, and how the narrator goes about mythologizing the pain. You know how when people go through really intense emotional trauma, they tend to use extreme language to try and make sense of it? The text of Heartless does exactly this. It blows the scale of the emotional damage completely out of proportion to highlight the very real internal devastation. Notice the phrasing, he lost his soul. The narrator is actually referring to himself in the third person here. That's a classic literary device used to show detachment or even severe shock. And losing your soul, that implies a total, irreversible transformation. It's basically saying the person who existed before this relationship ended is effectively dead and gone. The stakes aren't just a broken heart anymore, it's a completely shattered identity.
Moving right along to part 2, the heartless antagonist, where we see how the other person is characterized.
Because, look, every compelling story needs a villain, right? And in a breakup narrative, the X is almost always cast in that role. But the text here goes to some really specific, fascinating links to paint this picture. Based strictly on the lyrics, the antagonist's heartlessness is defined by some very specific behaviors. Yes, she's described as being cold as the winter wind, but the true definition of heartless in this story boils down to one incredibly chilling act: suddenly acting like a total stranger. The line, "You walk around like you don't know me," is the absolute core grievance. It's that brutal whiplash of going from ultimate intimacy to complete icy alienation.
And this sets up a stark, brilliant contrast between our two characters. On one side, you have the other person depicted almost like a cartoon villain. I mean, she's literally referred to as Dr. Evil. But then, on the flip side, the narrator portrays himself as this wounded, evolving victim. He even acknowledges his past mistakes, saying, "I did some things, but that's the old me." This dynamic is a textbook defense mechanism. By flattening the antagonist into a one-dimensional villain, the narrator is desperately trying to absolve himself of the messy, complicated guilt of the breakup.
Which brings us to part 3, the 3 a.m. conflict, and those highly specific grievances.
Now, the narrative doesn't just stay up in the clouds with grand metaphors. It actually grounds itself in some very relatable, nitty-gritty relationship conflicts. It essentially builds a psychological timeline. We see the narrator constantly oscillating between 3 distinct phases. He mourns the past, reminding her of all the things that we've been through. He fights in the present, finding himself up 3 a.m. on the phone. And then he desperately seeks vindication in the future, promising, "Wait a couple months, then you'll go and see, you'll never find nobody better than me." It perfectly captures a mind trying to make sense of absolute chaos, just frantically jumping backward and forward in time to feel in control again.
And breaking down those present-day grievances really highlights the deeply contradictory nature of a messy split. Just look at this dynamic. They explicitly decided we wasn't going to speak, yet here they are up 3 a.m. on the phone. Boundaries are firmly set and then immediately completely ignored in the middle of the night. The narrator is totally lost, noting that she's mad at me and acting hot and cold. It just perfectly captures that exhausting, circular logic of two people who know for a fact they should walk away, but just literally cannot stop engaging.
All right, part 4, outside voices and friends, or the social fallout.
Because we all know a breakup rarely just stays between two people. The battlefield almost always spills over into the friend groups. The social warfare is super clear here. The antagonist weaponizes her social circle. She got a new friend and decides to run and tell your friends that you're leaving me. Her friends are even chiming in, saying they don't see what you see in me. She is actively using the crowd to validate her leaving. To counter this, the narrator defensively claims, well, I got homies, but notice the immediate, almost tragic admission of defeat right after. But at the end, it's still so lonely. He realizes pretty quickly that public posturing doesn't actually cure private grief.
So ultimately, the narrator just completely dismisses all that outside noise. He insists that the true depth of their shared history is something outsiders are just never going to understand. They don't know what we've been through. It's this desperate attempt to pull the relationship back into a private sphere, completely rejecting the public narrative his ex has allegedly spun up. It's a beautifully human moment, clinging to the sanctity of the private bond, even as you're watching that exact bond actively dissolve.
And finally, part 5, the final departure, taking off tonight.
After all the grand myths, the 3 a.m. fights, and the friend drama, the narrator finally makes a definitive choice to end the cycle. We literally get a step-by-step guide to leaving the situation unresolved. And honestly, this might be the most powerful part of the text. Step 1, he acknowledges she will just gonna keep hating me. Step 2, he accepts they will just gonna be enemies. Step 3 is probably the hardest. He decides he can just leave it wrong because she can't make it right. And finally, step 4, he decides to just take off tonight, into the dark. He stops trying to fix it, he just completely accepts the fracture.
And that leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought to ponder. The narrator claims he's taking off into the night, leaving it all in the rear view. But if you literally spend an entire story obsessively detailing every single grievance, every late-night phone call, every tiny slight from her friends, and casting the whole thing as an epic tragedy, have you actually taken off? Or does the very act of telling this exact story prove that you are still hopelessly trapped, just totally lost out there in the winter wind? It's a brilliant contradiction that makes this text so endlessly fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I highly encourage you to take a closer look at the stories you tell yourself when things fall apart. Until next time,